Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about testing. Do you need it? If so, why do you need it? When do you need it? What type of testing do you need? And who should be writing those tests? So if this is interesting to you, stay tuned and let's go. All right, let's talk about testing. So the first question I want to answer is, do you need testing? Now you may be thinking that's a rhetorical question. Obviously, you need testing. But I believe there's one scenario where you do not necessarily need testing. Let's say you're a solo developer. You're the only one, right? Solopreneur. And you're writing an app. Maybe it's just a simple app that hits an API with some UI. Well, in that scenario, you wrote all the code. The code is super simple. All it does is it calls an API and returns some stuff, right? Maybe there's a minute amount of UI logic, but you want to ship it. Right? So maybe I would say in that scenario, you probably don't need testing. Now, if your app grows and suddenly you have multiple logic branches and your application becomes more complicated, then definitely you're gonna want to write some tests, at least to cover the basics. But if it's just you and the app is simple, I would wager, I would recommend that you just write your code, because you know your code really well. And if it's simple, you're going to manually test it. You're probably going to find some bugs. So I would say in that case, you probably don't need tests. But in every other case, you do. And you may be asking then, well, why do I need tests? Isn't my software just, gonna be balling out the door? Well, let me answer that question. No, your software is not gonna be balling out the door. And here are some reasons why you may want to write some tests. First of all, tests will improve the quality of your software. You will have less bugs at launch, which will then translate into increased customer satisfaction. I mean, customers are not going to be like, wow, there's so many bugs. Like sometimes you'll get a game that comes out and you can like walk through walls and fall through the floor. Well, that's because quality's bad. So customers complain. And when your application is good, when it's really bug free, that can translate into marketing, free marketing. So improved quality is really quite important, and that's why you don't want to have any bugs at launch, at least not any glaring ones, right? Next, cost savings. So again, this isn't obvious. Tests? Tests also cost money, right? Because you need to spend time writing them. Somebody's getting paid for that. But if you think about it long term, you do save money later, because if you have tests and you find the bugs early on, you don't need to fix them later, which results in reduced maintenance costs. Because if your tests are solid, you don't need much maintenance. You need to come back to that code, right? Because it's solid. So you do save money later on, but just putting up a little bit more effort up front. And trust me, the upfront effort will cost you less than effort later on. All right, so reduced risk. I think this, again, maybe not that obvious, but if you think about things like compliance, if you have tests, For example, that test make sure your encryption algorithms work really well, right? Let's say you're storing some PII and personally identifiable information, and you need it to be encrypted. You want to make sure your encryption is all legit, right? All of that is working as intended. For privacy and integrity and all these other things, like you want to make sure that you are both compliant, maybe with government policies or internal policies, and for things like GDPR and all these other things, like in Europe, data privacy is a big deal. So you want to reduce the risk that your business will be dinged by bad code. And testing helps with that. And lastly, I would say that if you have a solid product with a lot of tests, I don't personally subscribe to like the code coverage thing. Like, oh, I got 85% code coverage, whatever, branch coverage, right? And 100% line coverage. That doesn't necessarily translate to a solid product. But it can increase confidence, which thus improves morale on your team, right? If your team sees like, wow, 85% code coverage and it all passes. Or I would say, for example, if you go to a GitHub repo and you see this little like widget in the top of the README that shows the percentage passed, right? Like, and the coverage percentage. That makes me feel like, oh, this library is good. So it does improve morale of the team, makes your product more solid, and it also allows you to iterate faster. Because if your tests are all passing, you can start modifying things without worrying that if you changed something else is going to break. Because if it does, well, a test is going to catch it, right? So you're confident in working on the code because you have higher test coverage. These reasons really are why tests are important. So if you do need tests, this is why. Next, let's talk about when you should be writing these tests. So this may be a little controversial, but in my opinion, in my experience, and I should mention, I was in QA when I first started. I was maybe 22. I started in QA, and now I'm a software engineer. So I have a point of view on this that comes from my experience as QA. But you don't need tests, in my opinion. Again, you do not need tests at the very beginning, especially if you're just starting a business and you want to get your code finished and a product out the door. You really want to be smart about when you start writing tests. So here we have I would say like a rough outline of the product process, right? So ideation, obviously not a single line of code is written yet. Research, again, no code yet. POC. Once you get to a POC, you are starting to write some code. But this POC is not necessarily, again, proof of concept is something that's meant to be thrown away. So this code is not going to go to production. At least in theory, this code will not go to production. A POC may be something that you build to pitch to investors. Like, hey, look at this thing we built. Give us money, right? And you don't really need tests for that. You just need it to show off a happy path, which you're going to thoroughly manually test before going to that investor meeting. So you don't need tests just yet. Let's say investors are like, all right, here's 10 million, go to town. Well, you're going to start planning and design at that point. You're not going to be writing any code just yet. And finally, once you have a rough sketch of what your product's going to be, you're going to start development. during development, you're going to want to start writing tests because you're going to be coding. So we'll cover which tests in the next section, but this is the point where tests come in: unit tests, integration tests, and so on. But during coding, depending on how fast you're iterating, right? Especially if you have investors who are asking for features, or potential customers, they're like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had this drop down over here or something like that, right? And at this point, the code is so malleable that it's not necessarily a good idea to write tests just yet. At least not in a large volume, because you may be completely rewriting the code and throwing away those tests. And when you're trying to meet a deadline, when you are, you're burning down your runway, you don't have time to waste. You are not a large corporation, right? You're starting a SaaS business, so you can't be wasting time. So you have to be smart about when you write those tests as you're coding. And we'll talk about that a little bit in what type of tests you want. Next, you have the alpha stage and the beta stage. So these are essentially testing stages. Maybe in alpha, you'll have some really trusted early customers who you're going to show your code. At that point, you should theoretically be feature complete or almost feature complete in the alpha. And you should therefore start writing a significant amount of tests. Once you're in beta, you should definitely be writing a lot of tests, making sure your product is solid, making sure nothing is broken, especially in the UI. So this is kind of the later layer of tests, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. Lastly, when you're in the QA and UAT is a user acceptance testing. So when you're in this stage here, definitely tests are being written. You're probably near finished with testing at this point, or at least writing tests, automated tests. So definitely testing going on here. So I color coded these. Red, don't do tests. Yellow, start doing tests. Green, definitely be testing. So let's talk about what type of tests you need. This is the testing pyramid. The bottom is basically what type of tests you should have the most of. And then at the top is the least amount of testing. This is, again, I took this image of a pyramid and I kind of reformatted based on my own understanding of testing throughout the years of experience that I've had. And at the very bottom is unit testing, which I totally 100% agree. Unit tests are really, really good to have. They test core logic of your application. So all the if and else statements, all the switch statements, right? All of the calculations, methods, and functions, all the math, anything in your application that is logic should be unit tested, because it's the most important thing, So definitely write unit tests, and these unit tests should be started over here in the development and coding stage. Component tests. So these are tests where you're potentially, let's say you're using React to build something and you wrote a component. Well, you can write a test for that component, right? Or you've written an entire microservice and you want to test that entire microservice. That is component testing. You're testing an entire piece of functionality, right? Whether that's a UI component or a microservice, but it's a test that you're going to write that stubs out or mocks out the different parts of the application. So for example, you have like data coming into a dropdown. Well, you're going to mock out that data. You're not going to actually go to the database and pull the data for your test. You're going to just plug in some fake values just to make sure that your dropdown works. So that's component testing. Integration testing is making sure that all of your components work together. So this is where you'd have a call coming into a REST API that then goes into a injected service that then connects to a database, writes a record, and then you read that record and then you delete that record all throughout that flow. That's an integration test. You're making sure that your components work well together in orchestration. Then you have E2E, so end-to-end testing. This is where you can automate and you can also do a little bit of manual testing. So end-to-end testing is usually UI testing using something like Selenium, where you'll have an automated test that logs into your application, clicks on buttons, it puts text into input fields and such. It's basically, you're trying to simulate what a customer would do, end-to-end testing. Manual testing, this is just clicking around, making sure that, if, for example, you have an Excel spreadsheet and you have features and you're trying to cover all these features, making sure that when you're manually trying to do something in the application, it works as intended, right? Acceptance criteria are all satisfied. So that's manual testing. And lastly, UAT. This is user acceptance testing. So that's at the very end. This would be somewhere in the beta stage / QA UAT stage. This is where actual users will come in and click around your application, try to add records, delete records, use the UI control, stuff like that. And that usually is the least important, but it is also important because your users will, either pay you or not pay you, depending on how solid your application is. So all of these steps are part of testing. And some of these, like unit and component testing, go over here in development. Integration and E2E come in the beta, I would say, probably either late alpha, early beta, or maybe even beta and QA UAT. And then manual and UAT is throughout beta and obviously UAT. So these don't all happen all at the same time. You want to kind of phase in. Again, the most important is unit, and that should be happening over here. Now, you may be thinking, all right, well, that's a lot of tests. Who's gonna do all this? Well, I have an answer for that too. So the last question we want to answer is who should be writing these tests, right? So again, based on my own experience as a QA engineer, an SDAT, and a developer, I would say that the majority of testing falls to the QA team. I know it's the biggest rectangle here, right? This one here. But if we look at the pyramid here, the largest amount of tests is actually unit, which is done by developers. And I would say, like, by far, there should be more unit tests than any other tests. But developers are closest to the code that they wrote. So they should just do the unit tests. Once those are done, you are already feeling like you're feeling good about your application because you got a lot of unit tests, right? Remember the whole morale thing we talked about earlier. So then the QA team can pick up component tests. So for example, you can use in React, right? You could use like something like Jest, or in .NET you can use whatever the .NET testing framework, or BUnit or something for testing, Blazor, stuff like that. So QA team picks up a lot of the testing. What is a QA team? That is QA engineers, quality assurance, quality testers, whatever, and then SDATs. And lastly, users will do the user testing. So up here in the alpha, beta, and UAT stage, those are going to be users coming in and testing your stuff. And you're going to have some kind of a form where you're going to ask users to submit issues that they found. But majority of the testing does happen over here. That's why there is a dedicated QA team for testing. Now, again, depending on the size of your product, you may or may not need some of these tests. I would highly, highly recommend to have at least unit tests and integration tests. Component tests are also really good, although most of the time I find that they're not, they don't really cover as much, like they're not as useful. They look good on paper, like you get your line counts and such, and you feel like, oh yeah, the dropdown works. Oh, the modal popped up, you know, or the whatever the microservice is writing has, like, all the services are making sense and all the else if statements are making sense. But I found that integration tests are actually more useful because they test your components working together. So your logic is tested in the unit tests, and then everything else is tested together in integration tests. So I would say like integration unit tests are really quite important. But again, depends on the size of your project. So we've covered whether you need testing, why you may need testing, when you'll need testing, what type of tests do you need, and who should be writing these tests. I'll have this giant chart linked in the description below. But that is all for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.